November 17th, 2023. The River North neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. A renovation crew was gutting the interior of a four-story brick building on Rush Street, preparing the historic structure for conversion into a boutique hotel that would capitalize on the area's trendy reputation among young professionals and tourists. The building had stood since 1921, surviving Prohibition, the Great Depression, and decades of urban transformation that had turned this stretch of Chicago from a vice district into a destination for upscale dining and nightlife. Foreman Roberto Mendez had supervised dozens of similar renovations throughout the city, but something about this particular building felt different. The walls seemed thicker than they should be. The floor plan made little architectural sense, and certain spaces appeared to have been sealed off and forgotten long before anyone currently alive could remember. The discovery began when demolition worker Marcus Thompson swung his sledgehammer into what blueprints indicated should be a load-bearing wall behind the building's ground floor bar area. Instead of the solid resistance of century-old brick, Thompson felt his tool break through into empty space beyond. The wall was hollow, or rather, it contained a hidden chamber that had been bricked over and plastered to appear seamless with the surrounding structure. Thompson called for Mendez, who approached with a flashlight and began carefully enlarging the opening. The air that escaped from the sealed space was stale and carried a faint chemical odor that neither man could immediately identify. Behind them, other workers gathered, sensing that something unusual had been uncovered in the guts of this old Chicago building. The hidden chamber measured approximately 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and extended from floor to ceiling of the ground floor space. It appeared to have been constructed deliberately as a secret room, accessible only through a concealed door that had been permanently sealed with brick and mortar at some point in the distant past. Mendez directed his flashlight into the darkness, illuminating what appeared to be wooden shelving along one wall, several deteriorating crates stacked in a corner, and something long and cylindrical wrapped in fabric resting on a makeshift table. The room had the appearance of a storage space that had been abandoned in haste and then hidden from the world. But it was what lay on the floor beneath the wrapped object that caused Mendez to step backward. The skeletal remains of a human being lay crumpled against the far wall of the hidden chamber, positioned as though the person had been sitting when they died and had gradually collapsed as decomposition progressed over 6 decades. The bones had settled into an irregular pile, partially covered by fragments of what appeared to be expensive clothing, dark fabric that had survived the anaerobic environment of the sealed room better than it would have in open air. A pair of leather shoes, remarkably intact despite their age, remained attached to the foot bones. Near the skeleton, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, lay a small metallic object that glinted with the dull sheen of tarnished gold. Mendez recognized it as a ring, still encircling a finger bone that had separated from the hand. The Chicago Police Department arrived within 23 minutes of Mendez's 911 call, followed shortly by investigators from the Cold Case Unit, who recognized immediately that this discovery would require specialized expertise and careful documentation. The building's history as a Prohibition-era speakeasy was well documented in city archives, making it exactly the kind of location where mob-related violence might have occurred and been concealed during the lawless 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds. However, preliminary examination of the remains and the artifacts in the hidden chamber suggested a more recent timeline than the Capone era. The clothing fragments appeared to be from the late 1,950 seconds or early 1,960 seconds based on their style and construction. This was not a Prohibition killing but something more recent. Detective Lieutenant Carmen Reyes of the Chicago PD Cold Case Unit took personal charge of the investigation. Recognizing that the combination of hidden remains, the building's history, and the apparent timeline pointed toward organized crime involvement from a different era. Reyes had spent 18 years investigating murders connected to the Chicago Outfit, the city's dominant organized crime syndicate since the days of Al Capone. She understood that Chicago's underworld had buried countless secrets beneath its streets, behind its walls, and within its institutional memories. Most would never be uncovered. But occasionally, as buildings were demolished or renovated, the city yielded evidence of crimes committed when different men ruled different corners of the sprawling metropolis. The forensic team established a controlled perimeter around the hidden chamber, treating it as both a crime scene and an archaeological site that required careful excavation and documentation. Dr. Michael Okonkwo, the chief medical examiner for Cook County, arrived personally to oversee the recovery of the remains, understanding that this case would attract significant media attention and require meticulous chain of custody procedures. The skeleton would need to be removed bone by bone, each element photographed and catalogued before being placed in evidence containers for transport to the medical examiner's facility. The process would take nearly 12 hours, extending well into the night as technicians worked under portable lighting. It was during the careful documentation of the hidden chamber's contents that investigators made a discovery that would transform the case from a historical curiosity into a window on one of Chicago's most turbulent criminal eras. The long, cylindrical object, wrapped in deteriorating fabric on the makeshift table, was not, as some had initially speculated, a piece of pipe or construction material. When forensic technicians carefully unwrapped the bundle, they revealed a Thompson submachine gun, the iconic Tommy gun that had become synonymous with American organized crime during Prohibition. The weapon was heavily corroded but largely intact, its distinctive drum magazine still attached, its wooden stock darkened with age but recognizable. The Tommy gun had been hidden alongside its apparent victim for over 6 decades. The Thompson submachine gun was immediately recognized as a significant piece of evidence, both for its potential connection to the victim's death and for its historical value as an artifact of Chicago's violent past. FBI weapons experts were consulted to examine the firearm without disturbing potential evidence. The gun's serial number, though partially obscured by corrosion, was still legible on the receiver. More importantly, the weapon showed signs of having been fired relatively recently before its concealment, with residue patterns suggesting it had not been cleaned after its last use. Whether the Tommy gun had been used to kill the person whose remains lay nearby, or had simply been hidden alongside an unrelated victim, remained to be determined. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment of the skeletal remains indicated a male individual, approximately 5 feet 9 inches in height, between 40 and 50 years of age at the time of death. The skull showed evidence of trauma consistent with a gunshot wound, specifically a small circular defect in the occipital bone suggesting a bullet entry point at the back of the head. No exit wound was visible, indicating the projectile had remained lodged in the skull and might still be recoverable during detailed examination. Dental work visible on several teeth was consistent with high-quality American dentistry from the mid-20th century. The gold ring recovered near the remains bore an inscription on its interior surface, though decades of tarnish made it initially illegible. The FBI's serial number search on the Thompson submachine gun produced results within 72 hours that stunned investigators and immediately elevated the case to national significance. The weapon had been manufactured in 1928 by Auto Ordnance Corporation, one of approximately 15,000 Tommy guns produced during the Prohibition era. More significantly, this specific firearm had been confiscated by Chicago police during a raid on a suspected outfit gambling operation on March 14, 1958. The weapon should have been in the Chicago Police Department's evidence storage facility, scheduled for destruction along with hundreds of other confiscated firearms. Instead, it had somehow found its way out of police custody and into the hands of someone who had used it, hidden it, and apparently died alongside it. The implications of the Tommy gun's provenance were immediately clear to anyone familiar with Chicago's history of corruption and organized crime collaboration. During the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, the Chicago outfit maintained extensive relationships with corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians who provided protection, information, and occasionally the return of confiscated property in exchange for regular payments. A weapon logged into evidence and then secretly released back to its criminal owners would have required the cooperation of multiple individuals within the police department. The fact that this particular Tommy gun had ended up in a hidden chamber alongside a murder victim suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single killing. The breakthrough in identifying the victim came from an unexpected source. The gold ring recovered from the hidden chamber, once professionally cleaned and examined, revealed an inscription that read, S.F. Forever. Yours, M. 1955. Investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports from the early 1960s with known associates of the Chicago outfit, whose first initial was S, and who had been married around 1955. The search quickly narrowed to a single individual, Salvatore Anthony Ferrante, known throughout Chicago's underworld as Sally the Butcher, who had vanished without explanation on October 23, 1962, and had never been seen again. His wife, Maria Ferrante, had reported him missing on October 25, 1962. Exactly 61 years before the discovery of the hidden chamber, the NYPD and FBI jointly notified the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office of the potential identification, triggering a search for any surviving dental or medical records that might confirm the victim's identity. Remarkably, Salvatore Ferrante's dental records had been preserved in the archives of a Chicago dentist's office that had been acquired by a dental school in the 1982. Comparison of the dental work visible on the remains with Ferrante's documented dental history produced a positive match. The man who had been hidden behind a speakeasy wall for 61 years was indeed Salvatore "Sally the Butcher" Ferrante, one of the most feared and powerful underbosses in the Chicago outfit during the early 1960s. His disappearance had been one of the organization's enduring mysteries. As news of the discovery and identification spread through media outlets, historians and journalists began piecing together the story of Salvatore Ferrante and his place in Chicago's criminal hierarchy during one of the most turbulent periods in outfit history. The early 1960s had been a time of unprecedented pressure on organized crime from federal law enforcement, internal power struggles within the outfit, and dangerous entanglements with national politics that would eventually contribute to catastrophic consequences for several key figures. Ferrante had disappeared at a moment when loyalty was being tested, alliances were shifting, and men who knew too much about certain operations were becoming liabilities rather than assets. The investigation had officially reopened a 61-year-old murder case, though Detective Reyes understood that identifying and prosecuting Ferrante's killers was almost certainly impossible at this late date. Anyone directly involved would be well over 90 years old if still alive, and the organizational structures that had ordered and carried out the killing had long since been dismantled or transformed beyond recognition. Yet understanding what had happened to Sally the Butcher and why he had been hidden so elaborately rather than simply disposed of in one of the outfit's usual methods might illuminate a chapter of Chicago history that had remained deliberately obscured. The truth had been waiting behind that wall for 6 decades, patient and silent, until renovation work finally set it free. The building on Rush Street where Ferrante's remains were discovered had a documented history stretching back to the earliest days of Prohibition, when it had operated as one of Chicago's most exclusive speakeasies under protection from the Torrio Capone organization. The establishment had catered to wealthy patrons who paid premium prices for quality liquor and discretion. Its location in what was then a fashionable, near-north neighborhood, making it attractive to businessmen and politicians who preferred not to be seen in the rougher establishments on the south side. The speakeasy had survived multiple police raids through a combination of hidden rooms, advance warning from corrupt officers, and payments that ensured any charges would be quietly dismissed. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in Chicago during the autumn of 1962 involves the violent internal politics of the Chicago outfit, a man who controlled gambling operations worth millions of dollars, and a disappearance that baffled investigators for over 6 decades. The Tommy gun found behind that speakeasy wall was more than a murder weapon. It was evidence of corruption that extended from the streets to the highest levels of law enforcement. By the end of this story, you will understand how Salvatore Ferrante rose from immigrant poverty to become one of the most powerful criminals in the Midwest, why he became a threat to men even more dangerous than himself, and how his final moments unfolded in the same building where he had conducted business for nearly 2 decades. Salvatore Anthony Ferrante was 47 years old in October 1962, a compact, muscular figure who stood 5 feet 9 inches and weighed approximately 185 pounds of dense, powerful build that reflected his years working in his father's butcher shop before entering the criminal life. His hair was black, slicked back with pomade in the style of the era, and his eyes were dark brown, set deep beneath heavy brows that gave his face a perpetually intense expression. He favored expensive suits from Marshall Field's, silk ties, and Italian leather shoes that he had custom-made by a cobbler in the Taylor Street neighborhood. The gold ring he wore on his right hand had been a wedding gift from his wife Maria, inscribed with her initials and the year of their marriage. Ferrante had been born on September 3, 1915, in the Taylor Street neighborhood on Chicago's near West Side, the heart of the city's Italian immigrant community and a breeding ground for young men who would eventually populate the ranks of the Chicago outfit. His parents had arrived from Sicily in 1910, his father establishing a small butcher shop that served the neighborhood and provided barely enough income to support a growing family. Young Salvatore learned the butchering trade from his father, skills that would later earn him his underworld nickname when rumors spread about how efficiently he disposed of bodies for the organization. Whether these rumors were true or merely cultivated to enhance his fearsome reputation remained a matter of speculation among those who knew him. By age 16, Salvatore had fallen in with the 42 Gang, a notorious juvenile street gang that served as a training ground for future outfit members and was responsible for hundreds of car thefts, robberies, and acts of violence throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. The gang's alumni would eventually include Sam Giancana, who would rise to lead the entire Chicago outfit, as well as dozens of other men who would become soldiers, captains, and underbosses in the organization. Young Ferrante distinguished himself through a combination of physical courage, willingness to use violence without hesitation, and an unexpected talent for organization and planning that caught the attention of older criminals who were always watching for promising recruits. Ferrante's formal induction into the Chicago outfit occurred sometime in the late 1930s, though the exact date was never documented, and the men who might have witnessed the ceremony were long dead by the time historians attempted to reconstruct his career. What was known from FBI surveillance records and informant testimony was that by 1945, Ferrante had established himself as a trusted soldier in the organization, handling enforcement duties in the gambling and loan sharking operations that generated much of the outfit's revenue. He earned a reputation for efficiency and discretion, qualities that his superiors valued above mere brutality. When problems needed to be solved quietly and permanently, Salvatore Ferrante was often the man who received the assignment. In 1955, Ferrante married Maria Costello, the daughter of a legitimate businessman who owned several restaurants in the Taylor Street neighborhood and who initially opposed his daughter's choice of husband. Maria was 28 years old, beautiful and spirited, educated at a Catholic girls' academy and trained as a bookkeeper. She understood what kind of man Salvatore was, having grown up in a neighborhood where the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate business was often blurred beyond recognition. Their wedding at Our Lady of Pompeii Church was attended by over 300 guests, including several men whose photographs would later appear in FBI organized crime files. The reception lasted 2 days. The Ferrante household occupied a brick bungalow at 1847 South Loomis Street, a modest but well-maintained home in a neighborhood of similar houses occupied by Italian-American families with varying degrees of connection to the outfit. Salvatore insisted on maintaining a relatively low profile despite his rising status in the organization, avoiding the flashy displays of wealth that attracted attention from law enforcement and jealousy from competitors. Maria managed the household with the same efficiency she had learned as a bookkeeper, maintaining meticulous records that she kept hidden from everyone, including her husband. They would have no children, a source of private sadness that neither discussed openly. By the late 1950s, Ferrante had risen to the position of underboss, the second in command of a crew that controlled gambling operations throughout the near north side of Chicago. His territory included dozens of illegal casinos, handbook operations for sports betting, and numbers games that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue. Every operator in his territory paid tribute to Ferrante's crew, and through them, to the outfit's leadership. Police officers, ward politicians, and city inspectors received regular payments to ensure that operations continued without interference. The system was efficient, profitable, and had remained largely unchanged since the days of Prohibition. Ferrante's immediate superior in the outfit hierarchy was Sam Giancana, who had risen to become the organization's operational boss by the late 1950s. Giancana was a former 42 gang member like Ferrante, and the two men had known each other since childhood, though their relationship was professional rather than personal. Giancana was volatile, ambitious, and increasingly involved in activities that made traditional outfit leaders nervous, including alleged collaborations with the Central Intelligence Agency on operations targeting Fidel Castro's Cuban government. Ferrante was loyal to the organization, but had privately expressed concerns about Giancana's judgment and his tendency to pursue high-profile ventures that attracted unwanted federal attention. The early 1960s brought unprecedented pressure on the Chicago outfit from federal law enforcement agencies, emboldened by Attorney General Robert Kennedy's declared war on organized crime. FBI surveillance operations expanded dramatically, with agents following known outfit members, photographing their meetings, and installing listening devices wherever warrants could be obtained. The pressure intensified after the FBI learned of the outfit's connections to the CIA's anti-Castro operations and the organization's alleged role in delivering votes for John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election. What had once been a mutually beneficial relationship between organized crime and certain political figures was becoming a liability. Ferrante found himself in an increasingly difficult position as tensions within the outfit escalated during 1961 and 1962. He remained loyal to the organization's traditional leadership, represented by elder statesmen Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, who preferred to operate quietly behind the scenes and avoid the kind of publicity that Giancana seemed to court. At the same time, Ferrante's day-to-day reporting relationship was to Giancana, whose increasingly erratic behavior and dangerous external entanglements were causing concern among the cautious old guard. Ferrante was caught between factions, his loyalty to the organization conflicting with his private doubts about its current direction. The specific circumstances that led to Ferrante's death remained unclear even after 61 years, but investigators were able to piece together a probable sequence of events from FBI surveillance records, informant testimony, and the physical evidence recovered from the hidden chamber. In the weeks before his disappearance, Ferrante had been observed meeting several times with individuals connected to the outfit's old guard, conversations that surveillance teams could not record, but that clearly indicated serious discussions were taking place. Whether Ferrante was conspiring against Giancana or merely sharing concerns that were misinterpreted as disloyalty, his activities had apparently attracted attention from those who viewed any hint of internal dissent as a mortal threat. The building on Rush Street, where Ferrante's remains were discovered, had served as one of his regular meeting locations throughout his career. The former Speakeasy had been converted to a legitimate bar after Prohibition's repeal, but had maintained its connections to the outfit, serving as a convenient location for private conversations and cash transactions away from the FBI surveillance that watched Ferrante's home and known hangouts. The building's hidden chambers, originally constructed to conceal liquor during Prohibition, made it ideal for activities that required privacy. Ferrante had been using the location for nearly 20 years, trusting it as a secure space where business could be conducted without interference. On the evening of October 23, 1962, Ferrante left his home at approximately 7:30 p.m., telling Maria that he had a meeting and would return late. This was not unusual behavior, and Maria asked no questions about his destination or the nature of his business. He drove his 1961 Cadillac sedan DeVille to the Rush Street building, where FBI surveillance lost track of him. Agents had been following Ferrante intermittently, but resource constraints meant that not every movement was monitored. His car was found the following morning parked 3 blocks from the building, locked and undisturbed, suggesting that he had arrived at his destination but never departed. No one reported seeing him leave the building that night. Maria Ferrante did not report her husband missing until October 25, 2 days after his disappearance, later explaining to police that she had assumed he was conducting business that required him to be away from home. When she finally contacted authorities, the response was notably muted. Police took a report but conducted only a cursory investigation, a pattern consistent with cases involving organized crime figures whose disappearances were often considered self-resolving problems. The FBI monitored the situation but made no significant effort to locate Ferrante, viewing his likely death as a matter of internal outfit discipline rather than a crime requiring federal investigation. Within the outfit, Ferrante's disappearance was never officially explained or acknowledged. His gambling operations were quietly absorbed by other members of the organization, his territory redistributed without apparent conflict. The seamless transition suggested that his elimination had been sanctioned at the highest levels, with arrangements made in advance for the distribution of his assets. Those who might have asked questions about his fate understood that such inquiries would be unwelcome and potentially dangerous. Salvatore Ferrante simply ceased to exist, erased from the organization he had served for over 2 decades as thoroughly as if he had never been born. Maria Ferrante never remarried after her husband's disappearance. She remained in the bungalow on South Loomis Street until her death in 1998, maintaining the household as a kind of shrine to a man whose fate she never learned. She refused all interviews with journalists, historians, and law enforcement, revealing nothing about what she knew or suspected about her husband's last night. Her neighbors remembered her as a dignified woman who attended Mass daily, tended a small garden, and spoke rarely about the past. When she died, she was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery, her headstone bearing only her name and dates, with no mention of the husband who had presumably preceded her in death by 36 years. The building on Rush Street passed through several owners in the decades following Ferrante's disappearance, serving variously as a bar, a restaurant, a retail space, and most recently as commercial office space before being purchased for hotel conversion. None of these occupants had any knowledge of the hidden chamber behind the walls, which had been sealed so expertly that no indication of its existence was visible. Building inspections over the years had failed to detect the secret space, its construction predating modern building codes and its concealment predating the requirement for detailed architectural documentation. The chamber had remained inviolate for 61 years, a time capsule of murder hidden in plain sight. The investigation into Ferrante's death continued through the winter of 2023 to 2024, with forensic specialists analyzing every artifact recovered from the hidden chamber for evidence that might illuminate what had happened on that October night in 1962. The Thompson submachine gun was subjected to detailed ballistic analysis, with technicians attempting to match the weapon to the bullet recovered from Ferrante's skull. The wooden crates found in the chamber contained deteriorated currency, approximately $40,000 in 1962 bills that had been reduced to near-worthless fragments by moisture and time. Additional items included a leather briefcase containing unreadable documents, a bottle of whiskey that had long since evaporated, and a set of car keys that matched no vehicle in any database. The ballistic analysis produced a definitive result in January 2024. The bullet recovered from Ferrante's skull was a .45 ACP round, the standard ammunition for Thompson submachine guns, and markings on the bullet were consistent with having been fired from the specific weapon found in the chamber. Salvatore Ferrante had been killed with the Tommy gun that was hidden alongside his body, shot once in the back of the head while seated, probably while believing he was among friends, or at least among people he did not expect to harm him. The execution-style killing was consistent with standard outfit methodology for eliminating members who had fallen from favor. The question of who had actually pulled the trigger remained unanswered. though investigators developed several theories based on the circumstances and the political dynamics within the outfit at the time. The most likely scenario involved a setup in which Ferrante was lured to the Rush Street building for what he believed was a routine meeting, then killed by one or more individuals he knew and trusted. The killer or killers had then sealed his body in the hidden chamber, using the building's Prohibition-era secret spaces for a purpose their original constructors could never have imagined. The wall had been rebuilt professionally, suggesting the involvement of someone with construction skills and access to materials. The corrupt provenance of the murder weapon suggested that multiple individuals within both the outfit and the Chicago Police Department had been involved in or aware of the conspiracy. Someone had removed the Tommy gun from police evidence storage. Someone had provided it to the killers. Someone had known where the bodies were buried, literally, and had kept that secret for 6 decades. The interlocking web of corruption that had made such crimes possible in 1962 Chicago was difficult to reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that remained, but its outlines were clear enough to suggest that Ferrante's death had been a collaborative enterprise involving criminals and allegedly legitimate authorities. Sam Giancana, the most likely candidate for having ordered Ferrante's death, had himself been murdered in June 1975, shot 7 times in the head while cooking sausage in the basement of his Oak Park home. The killing occurred just days before Giancana was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA activities, and speculation about the connection between his knowledge of CIA Mafia collaboration and his death has continued for decades. Whatever Giancana knew about Ferrante's fate, he took that knowledge to his own grave, leaving investigators to reconstruct events from circumstantial evidence and informed speculation. Tony Accardo, the elder statesman who had guided the outfit from behind the scenes for decades, died of natural causes in May 1992 at age 86. He had never been successfully prosecuted, despite a criminal career spanning over 60 years, a testament to his careful approach and his policy of avoiding the kind of attention that had destroyed flashier contemporaries. Whether Accardo had been involved in decisions regarding Ferrante's fate was impossible to determine, though his position as the organization's ultimate authority suggested that no major elimination could have occurred without his knowledge or approval. He, too, carried his secrets to the grave. The forensic examination of Ferrante's remains revealed additional details about his final hours that helped investigators understand the circumstances of his death. Stomach contents, remarkably preserved in the sealed environment, indicated he had eaten Italian food approximately 2 to 3 hours before his death, consistent with having dinner before his evening meeting. No defensive wounds were visible on his arm bones, suggesting he had not anticipated the attack or had been restrained before being shot. The positioning of the body indicated he had been seated when killed, then left in place as the chamber was sealed around him. The cash found in the hidden chamber, though too deteriorated to be spent, was documented and analyzed for what it might reveal about the night of the murder. The bills were primarily 20s and 50s, the denominations typically used in gambling payoffs and tribute payments. The total amount, approximately $40,000, was consistent with a week's take from the gambling operations Ferrante controlled. Whether this money represented a payment he had collected that night, a bribe intended for corrupt officials, or simply cash he had been carrying when killed, remained unclear. The money had been sealed in the chamber along with Ferrante's body, suggesting the killers were not motivated by robbery. The leather briefcase found in the chamber contained documents that had deteriorated beyond readable condition, but forensic specialists were able to determine that they had originally been typewritten pages, possibly financial records or organizational documents. The presence of the briefcase suggested that Ferrante had come to the meeting prepared to discuss business matters, unaware that the meeting's true purpose was his elimination. Whatever information those documents had contained was now lost to history. Another secret that the hidden chamber had preserved beyond the point of recovery. In March 2024, Detective Reyes held a press conference announcing the formal closure of the Ferrante investigation, acknowledging that while the victim had been identified and the cause of death determined, prosecution of those responsible was impossible due to the passage of time. All known associates of the Chicago outfit from the early 1960s who might have had involvement in the murder were deceased, as were the police officers, who had likely facilitated the weapon's removal from evidence storage. The case would remain officially unsolved, though the investigation had succeeded in answering questions that had haunted organized crime historians and Ferrante's surviving relatives for 6 decades. The announcement brought mixed reactions from those who had followed the case. Historians praised the thoroughness of the investigation and the insights it provided into outfit operations during a critical period. Law enforcement officials expressed frustration that the corruption enabling such crimes had been so pervasive that evidence had been destroyed or concealed for decades. Maria Ferrante's few surviving relatives, located in California and Florida, expressed gratitude that the mystery of her husband's fate had finally been resolved, even if justice, in the traditional sense, was no longer possible. The Thompson submachine gun recovered from the hidden chamber became the subject of competing claims from museums, law enforcement agencies, and historical organizations interested in preserving artifacts from Chicago's gangland era. The weapon's documented history, from its manufacture during Prohibition through its confiscation, corrupt release, and use in murder, made it uniquely valuable as an object that embodied multiple chapters of American organized crime history. The Chicago History Museum eventually acquired the weapon for permanent display, placing it in an exhibit dedicated to the city's complex relationship with organized crime. The building on Rush Street, where Ferrante's remains were discovered, continued its conversion into a boutique hotel, though the developers incorporated elements of its history into the property's design and marketing. The location of the former hidden chamber was marked with a discreet plaque explaining its significance, while the hotel bar was named the Speakeasy in tribute to the building's Prohibition-era origins. The macabre history proved to be a marketing asset rather than a liability, attracting visitors interested in Chicago's gangland past and willing to pay premium prices for rooms in a building with authentic criminal credentials. The Ferrante case prompted renewed interest in other unsolved disappearances from the same era, with researchers examining cold case files and historical records for patterns that might suggest additional hidden burial sites throughout Chicago. The outfit had been responsible for hundreds of murders during its decades of dominance, many involving victims whose bodies were never recovered. The discovery of Ferrante's remains demonstrated that some of those missing men might still be found, entombed in walls, buried in basements, or concealed in locations that had remained undisturbed as the city changed around them. The legacy of Salvatore Ferrante extended beyond his own story into broader questions about corruption, power, and the accommodations that American society made with organized crime during the mid-20th century. His death had been possible only because of systemic corruption that extended from street-level police officers to high-ranking officials, creating an environment where murder could be committed with impunity and concealed for generations. Understanding how such systems operated, and how they were eventually dismantled, remained relevant to contemporary efforts to combat organized crime and public corruption. For the residents of Chicago's River North neighborhood, the discovery was a reminder that the trendy district of upscale restaurants and luxury condominiums stood on foundations laid during a very different era. The same streets where young professionals now gathered for craft cocktails had once been patrolled by men like Salvatore Ferrante, whose business was violence and whose methods left bodies hidden in walls. Gentrification had transformed the neighborhood's demographics and economics, but could not entirely erase its history. The past remained present, waiting behind walls and beneath streets, for someone to finally tear it open. The hidden chamber on Rush Street had preserved its secrets for 61 years, protecting the remains of a man whose organization had once seemed invincible, and whose fate had been a mystery that some preferred to leave unsolved. The Thompson submachine gun, symbol of an era when such weapons defined the boundaries of criminal territory, had rusted in darkness while the city above changed beyond recognition. The $40,000 had decomposed into worthless fragments while currency itself transformed from paper bills to digital transactions. Time had moved on, but the evidence of murder had remained frozen in place, waiting for the moment when a demolition worker's sledgehammer would finally breach the wall and let the truth escape. The Chicago outfit that had ordered Ferrante's death no longer exists in any meaningful sense, its power broken by federal prosecutions, internal betrayals, and the transformation of organized crime into different forms for different eras. The politicians and police officers who had enabled its operations are dead, their corruption documented in archives but no longer prosecutable. The neighborhoods where the outfit held sway have been gentrified, their immigrant populations dispersed to suburbs, and their social clubs converted to restaurants and boutiques. What remains is history. Stories told about men who lived and died by rules that seem almost incomprehensible in the present day. 61 years is a long time for truth to remain hidden. Children were born, grew old, and died during the decades that Salvatore Ferrante lay behind that wall on Rush Street. The Cuban Missile Crisis came and went. Men walked on the moon. The Soviet Union rose and fell. The Internet transformed human communication. Through all of it, Ferrante remained in darkness, forgotten by an organization that had erased him, mourned by a wife who never knew his fate, waiting for the renovation that would finally expose what had been done to him on that October night when he walked into a meeting and never walked out again. Rest in peace, Salvatore Ferrante. Your long imprisonment in darkness is finally over. After 61 years hidden behind the wall of a building where you once conducted business, you have been brought back into the light. The Tommy gun that ended your life has become a museum piece, a relic of an era when such weapons spoke louder than words. Your wife went to her grave not knowing what happened to you, but your name is no longer forgotten. The secrets that powerful men buried with your body have finally been exposed, and you are finally at rest, no longer entombed in a hidden chamber, but laid to rest properly. Your story told, your fate finally known to the city that watched you rise and then erased you from its memory. The investigation into the corruption that had allowed the Tommy gun to be removed from police evidence storage produced disturbing revelations about the extent of outfit influence within the Chicago Police Department during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. Records from that era, preserved in archives that had never been digitized or systematically examined, showed patterns of evidence disappearing, cases being inexplicably dropped, and investigations being terminated without explanation. The Ferrante case was not an isolated incident, but rather one example of a system that had been thoroughly compromised by organized crime money and influence for decades. Is less than additions. Echo, additions complete. The investigation into the corruption that had allowed the Tommy gun to be removed from police evidence storage produced disturbing revelations about the extent of outfit influence within the Chicago Police Department during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. Records from that era, preserved in archives that had never been digitized or systematically examined, showed patterns of evidence disappearing, cases being inexplicably dropped, and investigations being terminated without explanation. The Ferrante case was not an isolated incident, but rather one example of a system that had been thoroughly compromised by organized crime money and influence for decades. Historians working on the case identified at least 3 police officers who had been assigned to the evidence storage facility during the period when the Tommy gun went missing. 2 had died in the intervening decades, their careers unmarked by any official sanctions despite their proximity to widespread corruption. The third, remarkably, still alive, at 94 years old, in a suburban nursing home, refused to speak with investigators, citing failing memory and poor health. Whether he had been directly involved in the weapon's disappearance or had merely looked the other way while colleagues facilitated such thefts could not be determined from available evidence. The Taylor Street neighborhood where Ferrante had grown up underwent its own transformation in the decades following his death. As urban renewal projects and the construction of the University of Illinois, Chicago campus displaced much of the Italian-American community that had once defined the area. The butcher shop his father had operated was demolished in the 1,960 seconds, replaced by institutional buildings that bore no trace of the immigrant enterprises that had once lined the streets. The 42 gang that had shaped young Salvatore's criminal education was dispersed, its members dead, imprisoned, or absorbed into legitimate society as the era of street gang criminality gave way to more sophisticated forms of organized crime. The psychological impact of Ferrante's disappearance on his wife Maria could only be inferred from the accounts of neighbors and distant relatives who had observed her over the subsequent decades. She had never sought to have him declared legally dead, maintaining until her own death the fiction that he might somehow return. Her daily attendance at Mass suggested a woman seeking comfort or perhaps forgiveness for sins that were not her own. The garden she tended with such care might have been a form of meditation, a way of imposing order on a small patch of earth, when the larger world had proven so chaotic and cruel. The outfit's decision to eliminate Ferrante, rather than simply demote or exile him, suggested that he had become a threat that could not be neutralized through lesser measures. Informant testimony from the era, reviewed by investigators with fresh eyes, hinted that Ferrante had been accumulating information about outfit operations that could have been valuable to federal prosecutors if he had chosen to cooperate. Whether he had actually been considering such cooperation, or had merely given that impression to paranoid superiors, was impossible to determine 6 decades after the fact. The methodology used to conceal Ferrante's body reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to make someone disappear permanently. Rather than disposing of the remains in the Chicago River or Lake Michigan, where bodies occasionally surfaced despite weights and other precautions, the killers had chosen architectural concealment that would survive as long as the building stood. They had selected a location with existing hidden spaces, avoiding the need to construct new concealment that might attract attention. They had sealed the chamber so professionally that no evidence of its existence was visible to the untrained eye. The presence of $40,000 in cash in the hidden chamber continued to puzzle investigators, who developed several theories about its significance. One possibility was that the money represented a payment Ferrante had collected that evening, intended for delivery to higher-ups in the organization but never completed. Another theory suggested the cash was a prop, intended to lure Ferrante to the location by promising a substantial payment for services rendered. A third possibility was that the killers had simply overlooked the money in their haste to seal the chamber, more concerned with concealing the body than with recovering whatever cash might be present. The discovery of Ferrante's remains prompted several elderly individuals with knowledge of the era to come forward with information they had previously kept secret. A retired restaurant worker who had been employed at a Taylor Street establishment in the 1962nd recalled seeing Ferrante on the day of his disappearance, appearing anxious and distracted during lunch. A former neighbor remembered strange activity at the Rush Street building in the days following October 23, 1962, with men carrying construction materials inside at unusual hours. These fragments of memory, preserved for 6 decades in the minds of witnesses too frightened to speak, added texture to the investigation. The forensic analysis of Ferrante's remains continued to yield information even after his official identification. Isotope analysis of his bones confirmed that he had lived primarily in the Chicago area throughout his life, with no extended periods in other regions that might have suggested time spent hiding or operating elsewhere. Trace evidence on his clothing included fibers consistent with the interior of vehicles from that era, supporting the theory that he had driven himself to the meeting location. Chemical analysis detected residues of cigar smoke, consistent with accounts that Ferrante was a regular cigar smoker who favored Cuban brands. The relationship between Ferrante's murder and the broader context of early 1962 Chicago politics remained a subject of speculation among historians. The period saw intense FBI surveillance of the outfit, contentious relationships between organized crime and the Kennedy administration, and internal tensions within the organization over direction and leadership. Ferrante's elimination might have been purely an internal matter, or it might have been connected to larger forces that swept through American organized crime during this turbulent period. The full truth would likely never be known with certainty. The Rush Street building's role as a location for outfit business throughout the mid-20th century was documented in FBI surveillance records that had been declassified in the 1992 but never fully analyzed. Agents had photographed known organized crime figures entering and leaving the building on multiple occasions, though they had never obtained sufficient evidence to conduct a search of the premises. The hidden chamber where Ferrante's body was concealed had escaped detection despite this surveillance, a testament to the sophistication of its construction and the limitations of law enforcement methods during that era. The Ferrante case became a teaching example in law enforcement training programs, illustrating both the challenges of investigating historical crimes and the potential for forensic technology to illuminate cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. DNA analysis, isotope testing, and ballistic matching techniques that had not existed in 1962 proved crucial to establishing the facts of the case 6 decades later. Future cases might benefit similarly from technologies not yet invented, suggesting that the passage of time did not necessarily mean that crimes would remain forever unsolved. The families of other individuals who had disappeared during the same era contacted investigators, hoping that renewed attention to organized crime, cold cases, might illuminate their own unanswered questions. Several of these cases bore similarities to Ferrante's disappearance. Men who had simply vanished without explanation, whose bodies had never been found, whose fates had been subjects of speculation for decades. Whether any of these individuals had also been hidden in walls, buried in basements, or concealed in other architectural features of Chicago's older buildings remained an open question that might only be answered as those buildings were eventually demolished or renovated. The economic impact of the Ferrante discovery on the Rush Street building's development was ultimately positive, as the property's connection to genuine Chicago history proved attractive to investors and future guests. The boutique hotel that eventually opened in the building marketed its heritage as part of a broader Chicago experience that included tours of other organized crime sites throughout the city. What had once been shameful history that property owners sought to conceal had become a marketing asset that distinguished the property from competitors without such compelling backstories. The Thompson submachine gun, now on permanent display at the Chicago History Museum, attracted visitors who sought to understand the era it represented. The weapon's journey from legal manufacture to police seizure to corrupt release to use in murder and concealment for 6 decades made it an object lesson in American history that textbooks could never fully convey. Standing before the rusted weapon behind its glass case, visitors could contemplate the violence it had inflicted, the corruption it represented, and the justice that had been denied for so long before finally coming to light. The closure of the Ferrante case left questions that would likely never be answered with certainty. Who exactly had pulled the trigger? Who had ordered the killing? Who had helped conceal the body and maintain the secret for 6 decades? These questions would join the countless other mysteries of Chicago's criminal history, filed away in archives alongside evidence that told only part of the story. The truth, complete and unambiguous, had died with the men who knew it, leaving behind only fragments that investigators assembled into the most probable reconstruction possible. The city of Chicago had changed beyond recognition since the night Salvatore Ferrante walked into that building on Rush Street and never emerged. The neighborhoods he had controlled were now home to people who had no memory of the era when men like him held power over life and death. The organizations he had served had been dismantled, their successors operating in ways that would have been unrecognizable to criminals of his generation. Only the buildings remained, some of them still holding secrets that might be revealed when renovation or demolition finally breached walls that had stood inviolate for generations. The story of Salvatore Ferrante serves as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, even when prosecution is impossible. The truth has value independent of its legal consequences, providing closure for families, understanding for historians, and lessons for society about the costs of corruption and the importance of persistent investigation. The 61 years that Ferrante spent behind that wall were years in which truth was suppressed, but truth ultimately emerged. The wall that concealed him was eventually torn down, and his story, finally told, becomes part of the permanent record of a city that has always struggled with its complicated and often violent past.